Morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see all of you again. Last time I was here in late September, I talked from Isaiah 42 and 43. Anybody vaguely remember all of that? So you know the main points, right? You remember them all? I don't even remember them all. Well, I do because I kept preaching that same sermon in Nepal at like 3 different churches, so it's fresh on my mind. So let me give you a few of the highlights, because this message that we are eventually going to get up on the screen, there, that great graphic. That's the sun, in case you're wondering what that bright orb is. So we see it on the east side a lot. Anyway, Isaiah 42 and 43 is a point where God is talking about a new thing that he's going to do. And if you recall, the people it was looking forward to the people being in exile in Babylon, because Isaiah was not alive when they were taken off into exile. But he said, here's what you're going to be feeling, in another 100 years in these waves of Babylonian conquest. Because at the time Isaiah wrote, Assyria was the main power. Babylon would conquer them 100 years or something about like that in Isaiah's time. Okay, make sure I'm turned on. And so he said, but you're going to be all discouraged, and you're going to be all focused on the Exodus back in the book of Exodus, but I'm going to do a second Exodus. I'm going to do a new thing of deliverance. I'm going to move this up a little. Working on it. And so this new thing now, we're going to talk about that same theme of new beginnings, only we're going to go a generation after when Isaiah was prophesying, and we're going to talk about new beginnings, as you can see out of Ezra. And so, but God had said, but when I'm doing this new thing and you're kind of discouraged and you're looking back at, look how God worked and he's not doing that anymore. Why hasn't God shown up for us? Woe is us. We just aren't worthy. He's saying, remember who I am, number one, and this still applies for us today. Remember what I've done in the past, but don't stay stuck in the past. Look for what I'm doing right now. Look for God's fingerprints all around you right now in your world, because I'm going to do a new thing. And that new thing, of course, is what we're going to talk about, the deliverance from what now is Persia, the third kingdom that ended up conquering that land. And they will get to go back. This will be the fulfillment of that second Exodus. But it also looks forward to a much larger deliverance, which is the person of Jesus Christ. And the new thing that he did, that Jeremiah talked about, was a new covenant where God would come and live inside our heart. And no one could figure out how in the world would that work. How can the creator of the universe, and we know, of course, quasars and black holes and all that stuff, and this mighty power, how could it all get compressed into a human heart? And yet that's part of the evidence of God's power. That no longer is there a temple in Jerusalem to go worship, although that's the theme of today. Now you are the temple. Did you know, as you walk around every day, you're a temple, and God's living in you. You're taking him with you. You are the ambassador we spoke of, the new creation in 2 Corinthians 5, and you're an ambassador. So that was the last message. I'm going to now jump into what we're doing today. But Here's the setup for not only that one, but this same message. I want to remind us that as human beings, we do not prefer change. We don't like the unknown. I mean, different people can tolerate it better than others, but none of us like things constantly changing. We like the familiar. We like the predictable. But at the same time, there's things we look at and go, I don't like that. I wish this was different. And of course, the favorite whipping boy of our complaints is the government, but really we have a lot of things that we don't like, that we wish were different. And we have expectations about how life should be, including expectations for new beginnings. And you're facing at Elma Alliance Church a new beginning. And you might have some sense of anticipation and excitement, but you also have some, what's this going to be like in the future? Am I going to like it? Am I going to be disappointed? And so when we have expectations and they are not met, we get discouraged. Because that's just part of being human. And so I'm going to challenge you this morning to start to think about, what are my expectations, not just for this church, but for my own life in the coming months. I mean, Tuesday there'll be a big upheaval over, if the Congress does what they're predicting it's going to do, and state legislatures and governors. So it'll be yet another change and upheaval in our very polarized society. And so you might have expectations of how good it's going to be if this happens or this doesn't happen. And yet, we will all be disappointed by some part of it, even if it's not like, things will work out like we want. When I was in Egypt and Barack Obama was elected, they, of course, said, if your father's Muslim, you're Muslim. So they thought, hey, great, now finally America has a Muslim president. And they were very disappointed very quickly. I know you were disappointed in different reasons maybe, but they were disappointed because they expected an Islamic leader, and he was not that, for whatever other things that you might think. And so they were disappointed, and they got more hostile to America because Obama didn't fit their expectations. We do the same thing, though. We have expectations. They don't get met. We get disappointed and disgruntled. We'll talk about the disgruntled shortly, but we have to figure out how to handle that. But let me give you a key thing here. It's not that you are disappointed and that you have emotions. It's how you handle those disappointments. Because believe it or not, it's part of God's training program for your soul. That you handle disappointments, and are you going to take them to Him? Or are you going to sit and stew in them and have some other behaviors that are not as helpful? So it's a training program for your spiritual life. So let me ask you, rhetorically, but if you want to answer, I'll take answers from the crowd. What are your expectations? How are the next days, weeks, months, year or so going to fit your expectations for this church? For your own personal life, because they intertwine, but they're not identical. What are your expectations going to be? How will you respond? Well, now we're on to Ezra. We are a century after Isaiah 43's promise of a new Exodus, and the remnant of Israel is now going to return. So remember, Assyria in Isaiah's time, Babylon conquers. That's in 3 waves. They're taken off into exile in the early, right before the turn of the century, 605 BC, etc., until 589, when the temple's destroyed. And that's a big theme of today because they're going to rebuild that temple. But so now this is the promise. This is this Persian King Cyrus that we're going to just take a quick peek at Ezra 1 and 2, but we'll mostly be in Ezra 3. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, that's Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Which, by the way, we don't really know that Cyrus was a follower of the Lord God Yahweh. But he sure knew the prophecies Isaiah wrote about him. And he knew that there was this 70-year thing. So he was pretty up on what was going on biblically, maybe more than the Israelites themselves were. And so he says, I'm going to fulfill what God's called me to do, even if I don't follow him. And I'm going to let not just the Israelites, but other people got to go back to their lands too. That was the foreign policy, or how they handled they let them go back versus what Babylon and Assyria did. So 50,000 plus Jews agreed to leave their lives, and they are in a city called Babylon that's part of the kingdom of Persia because it's been conquered. So, but when you see this there in Babylon kind of talk, it's still Persian at this point. So they risked this dangerous, difficult journey across the desert. Yes, God promised a second Exodus, streams of water in the wilderness, remember that. But it doesn't mean it was easy going, thousands thousands of miles across the desert from what's now Iraq back into Israel. And this dangerous, difficult journey is to rebuild their land. And they get to the land. This is not the same land that they had left 70 years ago. Some of them will remember that. It's decimated. The walls have been torn down, as Nehemiah wrote. The people around them are hostile toward them because these are not like, oh, look, our fellow countrymen, the Jews are coming. Nope, they resettled new people into the land. It's a mixture. That was part of the Samaritan thing that Jesus encountered, is that they're a mixed group of people that are hostile to them. The temple is destroyed. And so you have to say that would be a pretty challenging new beginning. So the walls being down isn't like, it's not a decorative thing. This is your security system. This is your early warning radars with your airplane. Imagine if America had a problem and we were conquered and we no longer have any air defense, any borders, and any way to know when an enemy's coming in. That's what it was like for them. They were quite vulnerable with no walls. They're vulnerable without a temple, and their neighbors don't like them. Now, you might be feeling uncomfortable and feel like, gosh, today's just as threatening feeling. And maybe it is. But they trusted that God brought them there. Do you trust God has brought you here for this time? For all that's going and swirling around us, from the changes in Alma Alliance Church to the changes in the state of Washington, nationally, internationally, how do we respond to our own challenging new beginnings in these different arenas? So now Ezra 3. When the 7th month came, so we know it's around September, late September, and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. So in the face of challenging new beginnings, unity is essential. They gathered as one. Do you remember when Jesus was about to be crucified? And in John 17, the high priestly prayer, the last prayer for the church, what Jesus prayed for? Do you remember? That they may be one as you and I are one. Now, I can sit and look back and go, man, Jesus, maybe you should have had a longer list. Maybe that they might keep their doctrine pure, that they might not morally fall, that they might not get so politically charged about the Messiah overthrowing the Romans that they still can't get it right. That, and you think of all the things in church history that you wish God would have prayed for on our behalf, but the most important thing that last night was unity. It was oneness, that we stay together. We aren't doing real good in that department, by the way, in my view, but oneness does not mean that we agree on everything. I think one of the greatest testimonies that we are God's people is our unity. When we love and respect each other, even when we have differing views on things like lesser doctrines. Whether the rapture comes here or there's a rapture at all, or did tongues pass away or they didn't, can women do this in the church or not, musical styles, social issues, even politics. Well, and this is stretching it now, Huskies and Cougars can live together. Some of you are Huskies, and I can live with that. Except right after Thanksgiving, and then there might be some tension. And it'll usually be the tension of the Cougar fans who, no matter how good they are and how bad the Huskies are, the Cougars are going to lose. We have an expression for what happens, and for Washington State, when they lose, they go, they couged it again. Yeah, there's a whole syndrome of, blowing it and choking in the end. And anyway. But imagine, and in all seriousness, that politics thing is a big deal nowadays. You're kind of like, there's litmus tests of people that if you don't vote, Republican, or you vote for these far-right Republicans, now we have a category of not real Republicans. And so if you're not voting that way, then you're not following God. And I forget which guy it was out of the Southern Baptists. It was Albert Mohler maybe, or one of those guys that said, if you don't vote this way, then you're really not following Jesus. I had somebody tell me that like 20 years ago, too. If you vote Democratic, you can't really, if you're a pastor, you can't be a pastor. Now, folks, how did we replace our loyalty and citizenship kingdom as our priority with trying to decide if somebody's really a follower of Jesus based on their politics? Now, you might disagree with me, but what I'm telling you is we can disagree because our unity before the world is going to make a big statement, even more so nowadays. That we can disagree, and we can have good reasons to disagree, and we have to show the world that we are one on the stuff that matters, which is the stuff of Jesus. So, when we are caught up in that disunity, then we're not acting as they acted when they came together as one. Now, imagine if they got back, because things were not very good, and we'll talk about all the problems that they faced. But if they start grumbling, well, how come you didn't take care of this? Look at this. What? There's no clean water. What's going on with that? Somebody needs to do something about that wall, and etc. And they could start grumbling. But guess what happens in a group when people start complaining and griping and grumbling? What happened in the desert when Israel was being taken to the promised land? They perished. They lasted 40 years grumbling, complaining, and it's cancerous. It spreads. And they did not do that. They didn't let all their struggles and disagreements about how things should be done, they didn't listen to the disgruntled. See, when we grumble, we create disunity. And we miss what God is doing in our midst because we're so complained and focusing on what we don't like that we miss what God is doing. So what is God doing in your life? Let me ask again. What's he doing in Elma Alliance Church? Or are you kind of still waiting for things to get back to normal? Folks, bad news. They're not going to get back to normal. Have we not figured that out by now? It's one thing after another. And it won't be like it was. And that's sad. I mean, you're just like, okay, come on, let's just get over it. Well, it's not so easy to get over. Supply chains worked, and there were things, inflation wasn't, rampant, and people weren't losing, their household incomes even if they had them. It's not so stable as it once was. And we have to let ourselves grieve that, but realize that the normal that we thought we had is gone. But we still can begin again with unity. We can still say, when we start over in this new beginning, the first thing that we need to remember is we're going to do it together. We're going to do it as one. Right? That's where we have to start. It's not the only thing, but let me ask how we're going to protect our unity in this church. These next transition months are a time for God to speak into your heart and into our corporate church life's heart. And for God to speak means you have to carve out some time to listen. And God doesn't usually okay, God, I got 2 minutes. Let's do that devotional thing. I'll read a passage, and then you got about 30 seconds to speak to me. God, sort of is that what Jesus did? I'm going to go out and walk for, an hour to get out to the edge of town in the wilderness, going to let God talk to me for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to come back in because we've got a busy day ahead of us. That's kind of how Peter looked at it. Look, everybody's looking for you. What are you doing out here? We got stuff to do, and you're just kind of hanging out with the rocks. So what will we do for God to speak into our hearts? Will you take the time and listen for him to show you what he wants to do next for you and for us? And let me say again, as I said last time, part of the purpose of an interim period, because I don't come as a temporary senior pastor. I come as an interim to kind of be a resource consultant to help you figure out who you want to be. It's not up to me to tell you, you should be this and this and this and this and this. Obviously, there's some biblical things that we need to be, but, I'm not here to tell you that, come on, Kim, a hymn, really? You had to do a hymn? You had to do all 4 verses? Yeah? You know, there are people that I'll bet if, don't raise your hands, but you probably, that was my favorite song of the morning because it has a something for you in your history, and you need that. And some others go, I just love this other song because I remember I heard it in the radio and it's contemporary. We need all of this to be together and not war with one another, because before there was polarization over politics, we had worship wars for the 20 or 30 years before that. And I've heard it all, that sounds charismatic, that sounds liberal, I was in a Baptist church, that sounds Reformed. That was like a big dig at the Reformed people, they thought. I never did quite understand, yes, so what's wrong with that? Never mind. But anyway, so we have to get together and we have to let God speak into our heart. And part of this time is to celebrate what God has done in the past. We're not here to say, look, no one mentioned the name Aaron. Don't say it, with you. Say it. Let yourself say it. We are grieving the loss of our pastor and his wife and their daughter, and we miss him. It's okay. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't pretend you don't feel those things, because, as I have heard stories, he was a very pastoral, caring, nurturing person, and that has to leave a gap in your life. It's okay. But just like, Isaiah said, you celebrate the past, you let the past help you learn, but I'm going to do a new thing. And so we don't, at sacrificing the past, we don't pretend it doesn't exist. We move into the next phase. The new thing God's going to do that we don't miss. While we remembered the first Exodus, God said, I promised you a second one. And now he's fulfilling it. And so don't forget the past, but let's look to the future. Let's say, I got questions about how things are now. So I have grief, I have questions about the present circumstances, and I have fear of this unknown future. This author named Joseph Addison said, our real blessings often appear to us in the shape of pains, losses, and disappointments. You ever wonder why they let people like that write? Pains, losses, and disappointments. That's part of what we mentioned, that God works in our unmet expectations to shape us spiritually, because it's not about us getting all the stuff we want. It's about us drawing closer to him. So it's important, number one, to guard unity. Even if we have different opinions, we share the common bond of Jesus. Then Ezra 3, verses 2 and 3. Then Yeshua, which, by the way, was an Old Testament iteration of the name Jesus, and his fellow priests and Zerubbabel began to build the altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice the burnt offerings on it in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both morning and evening sacrifices. So in their new beginning, when the leaders saw the pile of rubble where the temple once stood, and by the way, an altar's being built, and there's nothing around it. There's no building. It's out in the open. The first thing that they did was they built an altar. They built an altar before they built the temple. They haven't laid the foundation yet. Why? Because worship is our beginning point. Worship is always our beginning point. And so they start with this and they say, out of the rubble of our past disobedience, God, we first want to offer these sacrifices as Moses prescribed, because we want to be right with you, Lord. The image of the altar would cement their memory, the foundation of their new beginning of relationship with God. Whatever we build, it has to be on a foundation of our relationship with God. Not we have to do this program, and maybe, but we need a foundation. We start with worship, which is more than singing, by the way. So in spite of threatening circumstances, the people around them, they worship God openly. Before they began, they renewed this relationship with God, because seeking God is our daily life source, not just a Sunday event. It's something you do all week long. You get an extra dose and charge this morning, but you live it out the rest of the week because you spend time with him. Now, you might be feeling, and I said this last time, that the first priority should be finding a new pastor. But that's not going to be our first thing to do. The first thing I'm going to do is try to hear what you have to say. And so Greg has mentioned, maybe Steve will say something. I wasn't planning on it, but now I am. So all I want to do is just talk and hear your story of not just Elma Alliance Church story of how you came here. I do want to hear that, what brought you here, what drew you here, what keeps you here, what do you like, what things do you wish could happen that haven't happened yet. And it's okay. I'm not taking a list of your name and your reports back to the governing board. It's okay. And I'll give a general summary of the stuff that's said. But I want to hear about you, how you came to know Jesus, and what in your life is like eating your lunch, and what is giving you joy. And that's kind of our way to get to know you and get to know the church, because we'll do evaluations with a leadership team that gets put together. But the soft side of hearing people and what they think is you can't replace it with objective surveys. So we want to hear from you. And so if you think your name's on the list and it's not, and by, I don't know how long, because the holidays will disrupt. Let's say in early January, if I haven't called you, and please come up to me and say, I want to make an appointment now. I would love that to save me the call. If you haven't heard in early January, then just make sure that we got your name on the list. Or you know somebody that hasn't heard, and they're wondering, well, why hasn't Pastor Steve called me? Well, just give me their name and I will call them, because I may not have a complete list. So all that, it's not a threatening thing. Last time I did this, someone goes, I don't go to the church hardly ever. I don't want to get involved. I don't vote. I'm not a member. I don't care. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your story. I don't care if you've just come this week. I want to hear your story. If you know somebody who quit coming, we want a list of those people, so we want to hear why they quit coming and what their story is and how we can encourage them, even if they don't come back, which probably most of them won't. But we want to take this corporate thing of what is God doing in our midst and put it together on paper to figure out what God's up to. So the first priority is to figure out where we've been, where we are now, and where we want to go, because you're going to pick a pastor with a vision of here's who we want to be that we feel God is calling us to. Let's find somebody to fit that, rather than let's have somebody come in and tell us how to be, because I've been at this 35 or 40 years, and I know how it works when you come in as a pastor and say, here's what we're going to do, and the people are going, yeah, well, good luck with that. Be warm, be filled. I'll be at home doing my thing. So we need to own this vision together to figure out who the next person should be to join us in what God is doing. And that's how we'll search for a new pastor. So here's the 5 stages. Again, listen to people. That's what we're talking about with the interviews. Assess church health. Identify and address key issues. Those number 2 and 3 are with what we call a transition team to help figure things out. Number 4, begin strategic planning. No, we will not put together a comprehensive 5-year plan with fine details for you to say, we already got the plan, new pastor here, you just fulfill no, but there will be some things that need to be addressed. So we will have some planning ideas of things that can get underway. And so there will be some strategic planning that goes on. And then last, coach a pastoral search. So typically, interim pastoral ministry says this takes 12 to 18 months. Just to kind of give you, some of you may internally have gone, but it does tend to take that long. And so if it's shorter, great. If it's longer, then we'll just see what God's up to. All right, Ezra, we have We did begin again with unity, and now we're working on begin again with worship. We're getting to that. Verse 4, then in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the festival of tabernacle, the feast of booths, where they lived in tents and camped out, with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each of the 7 days. The Feast of Tabernacles, late September again, right around Yom Kippur and those high holidays that we just went past. It celebrated, remembered Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. It reminded them when life was difficult and uncertain, and camping out for 40 years is definitely that, God is their sustainer. So God calls us to worship Him in the midst of our season of fear and uncertainty. And I want to just urge you, don't resist these times. Don't resent these times, but be renewed during these times. This can be a time to deeply meet with God. So number 2, begin again with worship. The people were fearful and fragile, but they were still faithful in seeking God before they even built their temple. So we need a new beginning as God has disrupted our unsettled world. We've kind of talked about that. We've seen all of these disruptions in the last 2 or 3 years. So what change in your attitude and your commitments does God want to make? So these are questions that we explore as a part of the interim process. We don't forget the past, but we worship God into the next stage. So that's begin again with worship. Now, number 3 is in Ezra 3:7. Then they gave money to the masons. These are people that make bricks, not the group that George Washington was a part of, to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea. So building God's house required investing themselves. Now remember, these people just came from exile, in Babylon and the Persian Empire. It's not like they owned land and had built up big businesses and were rich and prosperous and all of that. They were returning to their land without a whole lot of resources. They had obviously some, but it's a 4-month trek across the desert by foot. But when they get there, there aren't a bunch of crops waiting to get harvested. The olive trees were not all saying, please, someone pick our olives, and the cattle were in the field. None of that. There were no jobs, no economy, very scant resources. The refugees still saw that the house of God was a pile of rubble, and they gave money and food and drink and to buy construction materials, and they gave their time and their energy. So how will you invest yourself in these coming months and years? Invest into this church, into this community. And notice the leaders and the people began laying a new foundation. They did a massive cleanup effort. Now, this was Solomon's temple. You remember, if you've read, in Kings and all of the chapters where you go endlessly with this curtain and this gold post and column of this and that. I mean, this was an incredibly lavish temple. This was a temple that was overlaid, a lot of it was overlaid with gold and such. But anyway, it was built in the mid-900s BC. So when they got there, it was a pile of rubble, smashed rocks, chunks of burned wood, weeds, I'm sure, growing up amidst the debris. Nothing looked like a temple because the Babylonians took it down in 589 BC. So it's time to rebuild. So begin again with serving. We begin again with unity. We begin again with worship as our first priority of doing things. Begin again with serving. So how does God want you to serve in these coming months? Don't let the uncertainty keep you out of investing in God's kingdom. If you can't see 10 steps into the future, then just take 1 step that's in front of you. Because it's better to begin small with God than to not begin at all. It's better to do a little than to sit dreaming about doing a lot. So begin again with investing in God's kingdom, with serving. Ezra 3:10 and 11. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, With praise and thanksgiving they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love toward Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because of the foundation of the house of the Lord was being laid. So these songs, great, as great as the Lord, He's good, His love toward Israel endures forever, came right out of Jeremiah 33. They were prophetic lines that Jeremiah, who was a contemporary at this point, a few decades earlier, and they fulfilled Jeremiah's words. God had orchestrated a new beginning. He had not left them alone. He has not left us alone. And notice they were loud. They were noisy. We'll find in the next section, people could hear them from miles away. For all these hostile neighbors, they knew they were there, and they could hear them. We in Egypt worshipped outdoors under a tent canopy, and we were kind of loud. And this one guy that we had our offices in his building across the street, and he goes, "Worship is supposed to be quiet." But, I don't find that in Scripture, do you? I bet some of you were really noisy on Thursday night at the end of the Husky Beaver game. And you were screaming and yelling and all that, but you can do that in here. It's okay, right? Can they do that in here? Yeah, okay. Kim's not going to quit singing if you scream and shout. She'll love it. And lots of emotion. Great and powerful, faithful and loving God should affect our hearts, not just our heads. Faith is not just our intellectual understanding. We're more than just having right knowledge of doctrine and keeping our outward behaviors that people see all cleaned up. Really that's kind of number 3 and 4 of importance. 1 and 2 is that we have to have a relationship with God. And that like John chapter 15, abiding kind of relationship, which can go beyond what you know about Scripture and how well you keep your life clean on the outside. And then as you are doing that with God, number 1. Number 2, He comes in and changes the heart in those inner areas that nobody else sees and knows about. Maybe even you don't know about them all. And God wants to change you from the inside out, not just your outward things. And these are my favorite verses in this whole passage of Ezra 3, verses 12 and 13. Many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple 70 years before wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sounds of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. The young people, now I want you to imagine, they grew up in the city of Babylon and this Persian Empire, and they saw the foundation of the temple being laid. All they had ever known was the idolatry of Babylon and Persia and these kingdoms and all, with idols and different gods, and that's what they had seen. And now they get to do a temple to worship the only true God, the only one that they have known and heard about. And so they are in the land of promise in Yahweh's city, and they're laying a foundation for Yahweh's house. What an exciting and fresh new beginning, right? Now, what if you are an old guy or an old gal, and you remember what that temple looked like? You saw Solomon's temple before it was destroyed, that grand temple from the mid-900s BC. And it was larger, it was grander. We can go ahead and hit that picture. Larger and grander, overlaid with gold and silver in different places, decorated with countless gemstones. Moreover, Solomon's temple had these sacred artifacts. Their history, their heritage, their traditions were bound up in this heritage. The Ark of the Covenant is in there. Aaron's budding rod, a jar of manna, the Urim and Thummim. And most important of all, God's Shekinah glory that they literally sometimes saw. Ezekiel talks about this, the Shekinah glory, that you could see it in the temple at some points of Israel's history. God lived there. That's the point. How is this little puny, pitiful temple going to compare to that? That was their question. Boy, have we fallen into hard times. How will things ever be like they once were? Do you ever think that? Remember the good old days? Well, this temple would be completed about 20 years later in 516 BC. Herod the Great would come along in 19 BC and remodel it and add to it and make it more grand. But this is the temple they're building where Jesus would walk. He would minister. He would bring an even greater glory, the Shekinah glory of God in a human person walked the temple they were making. And it would last for 585 years, longer than Solomon's temple, until the Roman general Titus would destroy it in 70 AD. But this temple was going to last, even if it wasn't Solomon's. So at the laying of the foundation, there were cheers and tears. The young looked forward. The older looked back and wept. The older could discourage the younger with this new beginning, but even if it didn't match the former grandeur, they realized God is now at work. So we have to be careful because we need both the older and the younger, don't we? We need to bring both perspectives together. The past can be a rudder that guides or an anchor that drags, but we need each other. The older need the enthusiasm, energy, and joy of the younger. The younger need the wisdom, maturity, and experience of the older. So begin again with hope. That's our last one. Unity, worship, serving, and hope. Yield your memories and expectations to the Lord. Was your past happier? Better? Well, yield it to the Lord. Was your past filled with sadness and pain? Give that to the Lord too. Because we begin again with hope of what God is going to do. I want to close and ask you to pray with me if you want. Silently probably, but if you want to do it out loud, I'm okay with that. If things aren't what you wish they were, are you willing to commit yourself to what's coming up silently in prayer? I'm going to do this little phrase by phrase prayer. It's not a prayer of salvation, but if you want to just silently say this to yourself, if you're willing to make the commitment this morning to God that you want to, as you celebrate the past of what God has done, but we're going to move into the future. And I want to be with God. So will you pray with me and phrase by phrase, and I'll give you a gap to say it silently to yourself. Lord, you are God of yesterday. Lord, you are God of tomorrow. Lord, I yield them both to you. Lord, I want to live for your glory today. Show me what you have in mind for me. Show me what you have in mind for Elma Alliance Church. God, pour out your Spirit on us so the world can see Jesus in us. We pray in his name. Amen.